So in this video, we're going to talk about two things. One is to explain extension methods and what they are and to start making more use of them. And the second is to, at the same time as doing that, improve and start cleaning up this DNA framework and making this startup call use a lot more extension method style startup. So this will be the real world example in the DNA framework, and we'll also just explain at the start the basics of what an extension method is. So we'll just make a class up here for now, and we'll just call it public class or public static class test. All extension methods have to be in a static class. That's why I made it static. The extension methods themselves need to be static, so I'll have public static, and we'll come up with, let's say, the simplest thing I can think of is, say you want to check if a number is even or odd. And you could make, we start with a standard function, so leave it static for now, but let's say a standard function would be is even. And you'd need to pass in the, say, the integer number. And then you'd return if number modulus 2 equals 0. So if its remainder of 2 is nothing, meaning it's even. So there's your function. If we did, say, just any other function to invoke it, and we had a number, say 3. And then you'd do, if you wanted to find out if the number was even, you'd do test.isEven, and then pass in a. And that's just how you'd invoke a function. That's your standard, nothing special here, way of just calling a function. Now, I always think of it more of when you're reading code, hence all the comments as well. You kind of want to read your code like you're reading a book. You want to read through the code and it make as much sense as possible. And in English, I know in other languages you do technically do it this kind of way, but in English you certainly wouldn't say, if you wanted to ask somebody if the variable a was even, or if the number 3 was an even number, you'd ask the question, is 3 an even number? You wouldn't say, is even the number 3? That's not the way we speak. So this is kind of what we're doing in code when we're trying to read through. We're going test.isEven. Okay, something is even a. Okay, so is a even? And in your head, that kind of mental processing takes up time and also throws away the clear or the clarity of what you're thinking. This is in more of a complicated setup or part of some code that's, say, doing a complicated loop. And in your head, you're trying to keep your thought pattern as clear as possible. And this way of thinking about it is not ideal. It's kind of back to front. The same with like when we have a string and we wanted to say compare two strings. You'd usually say, well, is s equal to ss? But instead we do string dot equals ss, and it's kind of, again, back to front. What you'd prefer to say is s dot equals and then ss. And this is an example of an extension method here. So if we press F12, well, actually it isn't. It's built into the object in this case to give you the same thing. So they've actually put it in the string class, but the point is an extension method will look this way. This is what we're going to achieve, this kind of this appearance of s equals ss. It reads more clearly. So in order to turn this into what we'd prefer to say, which is a dot is even, then all we have to do is the first parameter of a function that has to be static and inside a static class, that's how they work, we would have this keyword. And then you can see now it magically starts working. And it finds this function because, for one, we're in the same namespace. So if we were to move this outside of a different namespace, so if we were to, I mean, this is just this standard code, this is nothing special with this specific setup, but say we chuck that into a namespace called test, and then in this DNA namespace we tried to consume it, you'll see we've got a problem, and that's simply because it can't find, this, because we're not using the test. So extension methods also need to have, in the class you're using them, the using statement to the namespace they're within, and then you can find them. And obviously we don't care about that because that's not the way we're using it now. So that's kind of how to create an extension method, and really they're that simple. So I'll just chuck this back in here for now. So all we've done is when you now type a dot, as well as all the built-in things to the class of a, which is an integer. So all these are built into, the integer. This is, as you can see, this little down arrow, I presume, represents an extension method. That is then being found from here. So that's an extension method, and that means we can have, a dot is even, and it reads more clearly to me. That's more logical way of, instead of saying test dot is even a, you're literally asking the question directly. So that's kind of what we want to start using, and really that's all extension methods are. That's it. That's the whole lesson, if you will. Hence why I want to start to actively use this in this framework to give you a real world feel of making heavy use of these. And one of the things you can do is chain them together. So you could say if a dot is even dot, and then you could carry on something else. And this kind of chaining is very common in .NET Core applications. And if we open the, let's go to Faceta Word source server program. You can see when you make a new ASP.NET website, that's what they're doing here. So they have webhost.create default builder, and then a dot at the end. So this returns a value, and we're then just doing dot on the return value, and then dot on that return value. So we're kind of chaining them. And this was inspired by JavaScript, I'm pretty sure, because they use this quite a lot. And there's not often, and you can see again here, build webhost.run. There's not often a major use for extensions. Like this is probably the most common use, is the setup and initialization of a program, if you will. After that, they're not heavily used, but they're certainly beneficial, so it's worth knowing. So what I want to do is turn now this framework that we've got, that we've just started making. So if you watch the last video, you'll find out what it is. I want to clean up the startup code where we're trying to pass in parameters into here to do configuration and injection, and instead have more of a natural flow that's just going similar to, like, say, a new framework construction, dot configure, dot use default services, dot build type of thing. The same thing as like an ASP website does. And it's these exact same chunks of code, but we're just going to clean it up. So instead of somebody just calling, like as we do right now, if I go to the Faceta Word application, right now we just call framework.startup. But if we wanted to configure this specifically, then we'd have to pass in a configure like this and do something with it. And we'd have to then pass in an injection method and do something with that. And then it doesn't look as clean as saying framework.build.configure.add services as you go, sort of thing, in a chained manner. Instead, it's all chucked into these anonymous, well, they're not anonymous, are they? The actions. So we want to change that way of working so it's more natural. Similar to, again, everything. Kernel.bind, .toConstant. It's this kind of chaining that makes it easier to read. So we're going to make use of extension methods and do that. So in order to do that, we'll first start with, just get rid of that temporary code. We'll start by renaming this to build, because this is now going to be the first step. Well, rather the last step that will return something we want. So we'll see this in action. Then, again, in order to do this kind of chaining, we need to make an extension method that returns a value. And that value is what you keep doing the dot on. So in order to construct all this, you can see these functions rely on like the service, the environment, the configuration, because then further down, this makes use of the configuration, makes use of the service. So in order to chain this into a ... kind of environment, we'll need basically a class to store that information, and that's what we'll new up initially. So we'll make a class, and we'll just call it framework construction, I guess. So let's just make a folder in here and call it framework. And then we'll chuck the framework and framework extensions in there. I don't get why it always tells me it's going to take a while to move two files. And then in here, framework, we will add another class. and we'll call this framework. Forgot what I was going to. Oh, construction. We'll call it framework construction. Delete the framework. RG. Control RG to remove them. Public class. The construction information when starting up and configuring DNA.framework. And that class is not going to be static. That's going to be, we're going to create a new class of that each time. And then to do that, as we mentioned, we need some public properties. And we will have, we want the services, which was iService provider, I think it was. Well, the iService collection. And that would be the services. So these are the services to be injected before it gets compiled. The services that will get used and compiled once the framework is built. And that's because obviously we have it here. Next thing we'll need is an environment because we use it there. So we'll have public framework environment. And we have the same thing. The environment used for the framework once it is, well, it's not once it's built, this is used straight away. And then we have, I believe it's an iConfiguration by the time we finish. iConfiguration builder, configuration.build, yeah. So we'll do a public iConfiguration. The configuration to use or use for the DNA.framework. Keep the comments the same. So we have those three pieces of information. So now we can return from our extension method this class each time, and we can have access to all three things we need to. So we can start chaining them together. So the way I'd expect it to work, if we were to make, say, a new function just to show you what I'm thinking, the way I'd usually do it is say a new framework construction. And then I'd do dot, and then I'd make some extension methods now that can chain off this and say dot configure, dot use default services, dot build. And that's how we'd start our application. And then you could also add, like, you know, dot use file logger, dot use whatever, you know, you can chain things together. And then you'd visibly break them up like this, and you'd comment each line. So you have a nice clear chain. So that's what we're aiming for. So the first step to doing this is once we make a new framework construction, we might as well initialize these things. So let's cut this line out. Let's make a constructor. And chuck that in there. And instead of services like that, will be the actual services. Then the environment, same thing. And then also we'll inject the environment because that is a hard-coded something we don't change. I've got no plan to change right now. The environment's one instance, it's not a changeable thing. And then we add the singleton of that environment. Oh. So we haven't actually changed anything here. All we've done is newed up the three things we need, or the two things we need. The configuration will come when we do configure, and then configuration can set that, you know, value, because we don't want to make that, we want that to be part of the setup. So that really is the framework construction done. So we want to now have a configure method. So this will be our extension method. So in the framework extensions, we will add, and you can see these are already, this is already an extension method here. So it's in a static class. I typically then in the class name with extensions and put nothing but extension methods in there. You can break that rule. It's just in general, I tend to do that to keep them clean. So if you're looking for a specific extension, it's easy to find. And then you have add default logger, which was originally using the service collection to add the logger when you wanted to do a logger.log without passing in a specific name. So we did that in the last video, but there's one already in. So we'll add another one. So this will be a public static, and this time, as we mentioned, all these are going to chain. So we're going to return this time a framework construction, and we'll call this configure. And then in that configure, to make it an extension method, we do this, and it's expecting a construction in the first place. Construction. And we will want to take the configuration specific part there out of the original build and chuck it into here. So it's a single parameter. And then we always return the original passed in construction. Chain the construction. Configures a framework construction. The construction to configure. The configuration, the custom configuration action. Control dot to get your namespaces that we need. And then we chain the construction. So in here, all we need to do again is basically rip out what we were already doing. So cut all that, plonk it all in there. We have a new configuration builder. We do everything we did. I mean, the namespace for directory. Environment now is in the construction we passed in, .environment. So now we can access that, and the reason we can access that is because, as we mentioned, when they make a new framework construction, it gets newed up here. So within this chaining of construction.configure, we can now access the configuration. Same for services. So this would be construction.services. So that's nothing's changed. We're simply making this cleaner looking. And the one thing to not forget is set the construction configuration, because this is the part that is responsible for setting up part of the construction. So configuration equals the configuration. And that's it. So now we've moved the exact same code from the startup class that's now called build out of there, and we have now a framework construction.configure, which is, you know, part of the step. So we've chained that out. You can see now we have login and custom injection, and then the build stage. So the next step I'd say we want is a kind of use default services step, and this will add the login, and we'll also add, say, an exception handler that'll just output to a log whenever there's an unhandled exception, which we'll make use of after, but I just want to at least add this class in to make it useful. So let's just start by making the exception handling thing for now, because it's just a few classes to put together. So we'll put this in exception handling folder. We'll make another one for interface, because this can be changed. So we'll just make a default one for now, and then again the user's free to add a different one if they like. So this will be called exception handler. Control RG, remove the extra, public interface. The interface for, or rather, handles unexpected, or rather, handles exceptions when they are caught and passed to the exception handler. And we'll probably end up expanding on this a lot more and having like multiple exception handlers, but for now we'll keep it nice and simple. Always start with the simple and then expand as you need. Don't make it overcomplicated, and then you know, there's no point. To keep it simple at the start until you have the requirement to make it more complicated. So it'll just be a single function which will need handles the given exception. The exception to handle. So like I say, super simple, single method, and then we'll add another class to the exception handling, and we'll make a base exception handler. So this is just a really simple implementation, the easiest we can get. That'll be a public class exception handler, control dot and enter to implement it. Handles all exceptions, simply logging them to the logger. logs the given exception. And then in here, all we will do is log it. So we'll then use the framework, which is just the namespace dot, and then we'll have access to now the logger, and that'll come from this static framework class, where we then call the provider dot get service dot, we've done this in the last video. So this is now accessing the dependency injection built into .NET Core to access the logger that we added, which we will add again, which we added here by doing, add file, add debug, add console, which internally we can't see there because that's broke at the minute, but covered that in the last video. So framework.logger will access the loggers that have all been bound, which will access the logger factory. And then we can log, and we'll do log critical source, which is the extension method we added before. Or again, I'm saying extension method because we're building them. It's not an extension method. Oh yeah, it is. It's an extension method of the logger. And then in here, we'll just do for now unhandled exception occurred. And we should really localize that, but for now we don't care. Exception, pass in the exception, and that will get logged. We'll make a to-do note here to do localization of strings. So we'll probably add this fairly soon as well. Also, we're getting a warning about a spelling. So I'm going to add to the project, right click, add spelling file, ignored words, unhandled, because that's a word in programming. And then I think if you close that, reopen, it's still going to moan. I sometimes just have to, I think that's a spelling warning. Yeah, it's just, I think it hasn't picked up on this ignore word. Oh, it didn't even add it. There we go. Helps if it gets added. Close the file, reopen, and it should go away. There we go. So, localization of strings, this will get dependency injected and localized afterwards. So for now, any exception we pass to this exception handler would simply log to the output console for now. We could change that to anything else, but I think that's fine for a base one. So we have the actual logger implemented now. So we want to be able to add that as part of this setup. So we do, let's take one step back. Where have we gone? There we go. So the next one is we want an extension method called use default services. So we'll place that in the framework extensions. That's the main one. So we've got configure, and then we want the actual use default services to add the most default services of this framework that we expect to, not every user to have to manually type in. So make a framework construction returnable extension method, use default services, this framework construction to chain it in. And we don't need anything for that because we are specifically just simply injecting all of the default services used by DNA.framework for a quicker and cleaner setup. So this is what people will expect people to use when they simply want to make use of DNA framework. They're not customizing anything, they're just getting going, they just want to get started. So that's the construction. As usual, we chain the construction so it can keep going ... And then here now we want to add the exception handling that we just made. So that we'd want to go, again, keeping it at what we'd like. We'd like to just do construction dot add default exception handling, say, or exception handler. And for that, obviously, we just need another extension method. And this, because it's a default, like these are, the configuration. Just do a bit of tidy up here. Then move that down. So the default logger will change because that's actually now we're starting to use like default exception handler. Default logger is the wrong name. Default logger will be for doing this. And then this default logger will be technically something different. This is to add the default logger in terms of being able to do logger.log without passing a name in. So we'll come to that in a minute anyway. So this is now here, use default services. We'll chuck another one here now. Because this isn't going in the exception handler class or an exception handler extension method, because this isn't specific. Saying default doesn't necessarily mean base. It's the choice of this framework extension class that we want to make this the default. So I'll put the default one here. So public static framework construction, use, quick copying that, use default extension, this framework construction. So I'm sure you're seeing the way to make these extension methods now and how useful they can be in chaining. So injects the default exception handler into the framework construction. And then we would do construction dot get the services, and we'll add a singleton. Again, I don't see any reason not to have a singleton right now. And type would be base exception handler. And I think that was all we need to do. So bind a static instance of the base exception handler. In fact, that's wrong. Once I exception handler, because that's how we'll be getting the exception handler. And we will need then to pass in a new base. Otherwise, we would have bound to this type, not the interface of that type. So we now bind to a singleton there. We could update the framework and go to the top here. Now we've got environment. We can now have public static I exception handler. And then we can do the same thing here. I exception handler. So now we can get the frameworks exception handler. I don't know why I put gets the framework environment of this class. No, it's not of this class. That's the wrong comment. For the logger, for the framework. I think we're just putting too much info there. There we go. So now we've got an exception handler we can make use of anywhere. Use default services is now finding this and running this. So we've added the exception handler. So we go back to this class. We also want to add this login. So if we cut all of this login out, and we then go to paste. Oh, not in there. Oh yeah, sorry, in there. So we've got exception handling. I know it's only one line, but if we're regioning the login, we might as well then region each little section. So exception handling, login. Services is just construction dot services, and the configuration is construction dot configuration. We add those. I'm not going to add the file logger as default for every single person that uses this framework, because this is now out in the wild. People can pull this NuGet package. I don't think adding a text logger is really standard. I don't want to start writing to people's hard drives unexpectedly. So I'm going to remove that file from there, but then we're going to add it back as part of the default services. No, we won't. We'll add it to part of our Facetto Word application only. And then that'll show you how to also customize the framework from being able to just build it normally to being customizable. So we'll remove that bit. So we just got to remember to add the file thing back in and then change that all. So now this is what we also need to rename. Add the default logger. I don't think we need an extension method there. In fact, I'm doing this wrong as well. This should be in the extension method. So we will have, and then we won't need regions because this will be a one-liner. So we add that, and what, again, I forget. Our default logging would be construction dot add default logging is what I'd expect it to say. Or add default logger. So because we actually have one here, like I say, it's technically wrong. We'll paste that in, change this to framework construction, change this to framework construction, and then add the default logger, and then that is now the comment of this part here, because that's the little bit that we're keeping. I'm kind of refactoring this. And there we go. Construction.do all that. Construction.services. Now this is where the add default logger is now directly there. Construction.services.add that. So nothing's changed there. And then we're returning the construction. And we said the comment was this. And then injects the, and let's keep the comment the same, the default blah 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 into the framework construction. Injects the default loggers or default logger into the framework construction. The construction. So then we call add default logger. We add console and debug logger. We pull in the login as normal. We add this specific non-generic iLogger so we can just invoke it. So there's our helper method there, or our extension method rather. Use default services I'll probably put at the top in terms of ordering so that it's better for the order that you start there. You add the exception handler, you add the logger. So we've got the logger and exception handler. So I think that is now all the default services we have. So we've got the default services. So the final one there, add file logger, will do in the actual Faceta Word application. But we still want the file logger to have that extension method to be, so we can actually say .use file logger. So for that, we want to actually add a file logger extension method. So let's go over to the file logger extensions. And in here, we've already got one. So we want another one again, specifically for the framework construction. We'll say add file logger. And again, the framework construction, or the boilerplate extension. And we'll also pass in a variable of, say, log path. And we'll default it to log.txt. And then we will go to the framework extensions, copy the same comment so it stays in the same kind of format. Injects the default file, or now in this case not default, so injects a file logger into the framework construction, the path of the file to log2, and then obviously we chain the construction so we can keep going, and then in that we'll now do the normal. So this is how now if you want to make an extension or you want to add a service that you can add just the same way to the framework, like you make a custom thing now and say this file logger was yours, this is all you do. You make an extension method exactly like this. Now you can do construction.services, and now you're at the dependency injection level. And now you can call, add singleton, add transient, all that lot. And instead we will call the add logging, which control dot, it's already got dependency injection. So you can see now we've got the namespace. This is where you can call your add singleton, add transient to do it. But instead we'll call this add logging, which is an extension method in itself built into the .NET Core framework. So we've done that already in the add default logger here. So we'll just copy and paste this because we've moved out the file logging part. Copy and paste that in, and we'll say add logging, or make use of add logging extension. And you can call this add logging multiple times to get back to your options. We don't need to re-add the configuration that's already been added previously, the same as those two. And now we just add back in the add file, which calls this extension right here. And then we've now got the option to pass in a path. So we'll now pass in the log path that's coming in as a variable. And this would be add file logger. So that's now changed nothing at all in terms of what our code does. But again, we've now made it an extension method. So now this should be add file log. We want to call this use use file logger, because that's how we're naming these. Use default services, use file logger. And then obviously this will be in the Facetto Word application. We could pass in log.txt to customize it, but that's the default one, so we could just do that. So we've now got down to this, exactly what we wanted, and the last step is to build, which is the last step of the build setup here. So that's the only thing left to really gel together. So the invoke now is no longer needed, where we had this injection to add services. Now, like I say, you can simply chain onto this construction and technically you could stop the chain and do .services, .add transient, add scoped, whatever, and add your own services. So there's no need for this injection method anymore because we control the flow here. So you don't need to pass in a method specifically to get access to these two values because we've got access to the construction now. So that whole thing can simply go. That's not needed. The one thing we will do, though, is turn this into an extension method. So we can call .build. So that'll be this framework construction. This comment, let's just restart this, should be called once a framework construction is finished and we want to build it and start our application. The configuration and injection is gone. The construction is the construction. And then obviously on our help page to the DNA framework, we'll now put a comment of this is how you use it. At the start of your application at the early stage, you do this. We'll make this easier again. We'll expand even more on this to make it even cleaner, but we can start with that. So as mentioned, injection isn't needed. Now we don't need a wrap around that because it's so simple. The build will still log, so we'll log the completion. Environment now is just environment because it's in the framework and it's been built here, will be in a minute. So this environment then will be pulled from the dependency injection. So we can just change that to the actual thing. So the service provider now uses the construction.services.build, and that's it. So that's now the final step of the chained thing. So really, all of these are just replacing this one function. So even though this seems more complicated in code now, so yes, we had originally one simple class that said startup, and it did all of that in there. It did everything. It configured it, did the default services, added the logger, and built. So you got the benefit of a single class there, but what you've lost is, one, the cleanliness to the end user to be able to do this kind of step-by-step setup. And also, everything we wanted to do with that, customizing this whole environment and configuration would have had to have been done with parameters passed into this method. So you would have had multiple parameters. We already had configuration, then we had injection. Then if we wanted to customize something else, you keep adding and adding and adding to these parameters. Whereas this kind of segregates it. And splits up the code into multiple areas. One way in a good way, one way in a bad way that you might go, where is everything? But now you can cleanly see where little chunks of the setup are, and you can invoke them as you wish and how you wish to build this service up. So you'll find that this kind of extension methodology and chaining is used a lot in .NET Core. The Microsoft team made heavy use of this, and I do like it in certain situations like this. So that's why I've kind of structured this framework in the same way. So we've got this now, and we just want to clean this up a little bit more. So to do that, what we'll do is we have let's folderize this again. Folderize, is that a word? Probably not. We have really the core stuff of the framework. So let's just say, well, no, it doesn't. Let's leave them as in the root. Let's make one called default. And in here, we'll add another class that's called default framework construction. In fact, we can make construction a folder. And then that can just go in. I should have just renamed the folder, really. And so can the framework construction. This really is the framework itself that stays out. So we have a default framework construction. What we're going to do is clean up that, make a public class default framework construction, and it's going to override not override, it's going to implement the framework construction as a base class. And we're going to make a new constructor. Default constructor. So in this, we already have the framework constructor running, so this will all run first. So we've got those three. What we want to do is take these, so that's nude, that's kind of, you don't need to do that. We want to do these two things because these are always going to be a default, if you will, configure and use default services. So we'll cut them out and we'll paste them in and we'll do this because we are the object itself. So if we now make a new default framework construction instead of a framework construction, we don't even have to do the configure or default services. So we just say configure and add default services, or there we go. So we have those two methods. What's this complaining about? No comment, good. Creates a default framework construction containing all the default configuration and services. So there's our default framework construction. So now this can be one step easier, and it can be now default construction, and then our custom line, the single line that's custom, is now use file logger and .build. So if somebody's not adding a file logger and they're using just completely off-the-shelf DNA framework, they can now just do that. New default framework construction.build. That's all they need to put at the start of their code. And all we now need to put at the start of our Facetto Word code is this instead. So this is what we want to do here. If we remove that to the clipboard for now, and I think, unless I've missed anything, this should now build. So that's built. So in order to test this, we will need, I can push a NuGet package, but obviously we want to test it here. So if you want to do this live when, say, the NuGet package isn't live because the video's gone up that quick, or you just want to edit the source code yourself to DNA Framework, just right-click on Facetto Word or whatever project you're in, go to installed, and let's just uninstall the NuGet package for DNA Framework. And then instead, we will add the existing project, which will be Angel 6 DNA Framework source. We'll add the project back. This is how it was before we made the NuGet package. And then in here, we'll add a reference to the framework. So now we're using the code we literally just wrote. So this should now fail because it's not called startup anymore. So we change that now to this. So new framework construction.useFileLogger.build. If we open the folder this is in and go to bin, debug, so we don't have a log yet, so there's no log file. So if we run up to this point, presuming all this builds and runs now, we should get the default construction. We should have what we used to have in the output. So we should have the log output saying it started. And we should also have a log file. So we've hit there. You can see we've got the stuff we normally have, which is the console and the debug logger. So I think the first one's the console, the second's the debug, hence the crit initial start of the string there for a critical message. And more importantly now, we should have the log file, which we do. So this log file has now got the log message in. So to prove that's definitely working, let's remove the use file logger, delete the log, and run. And you can see that's how easy it now is to configure this framework. If you don't want file logging, you don't do .add file log. So you can see we've got no file logging. So that's that. We can also say change the name, a new log.txt, and run. And we should end up with a file called a new log.txt in a moment. And there you go. So this is now nice and easy and configurable in kind of a chaining method. So say you didn't want to do the default construction. Well, you can see from source code, all we have to do is create a new framework construction called .configure.whatever. So if you wanted to replace this with a completely custom one, then you just do new framework construction .configure, and you could pass in then your default configuration and do what you want with the configuration. So you can add your sources, you can do whatever. So that's, you know, your option to do a custom one there. And then at this point you'd add what you want. So you'd do the use will be the extension method. So use file logger, use default services, or you can do whatever you want. But the point there is obviously now you're in complete control of this loop. So you could do .config.useFileLogger. That will no longer use the console logger because we haven't added any services whatsoever. So if we run that now, presuming we've got no missing dependencies, which we do, so you can see this logger, we have no logger because the useFileLogger is presuming you are using the default login. So if we went to, where will we go to? Logger extensions, maybe? Nope. Where was it? Framework. So the add default logger adds, in fact, that is a point. Why is the logger not added? Oh, because we haven't added this transient thing here. So this transient might want to be placed in. Well, no, really, this is the point as the default logger. So if we were to say chuck that in the file logger extension for use file logger and just dump it there, then the code should work just to prove a point. But that's kind of built in. So there we go. So we have no console login, but we should have file login, which is there. So that's just a little setup of showing you how you can now, configure this easier than we did before. Well, not necessarily easier, but nicer looking and easier to customize. And this is going to now be the new Facetto Word construction. So that's that. Let's just make sure I remove the thing from file logger extensions there. So hopefully that was a good explanation of extension methods, as well as showing you how to heavily use them at the same time as obviously making use of them in a real application, so it wasn't just wasted on a demo, if you will. The one thing I do want to mention with the NuGet package, I'll now push a new one live for the DNA framework, so this framework. What somebody noticed when I pushed this live was the NuGet package had no, once you reference a NuGet package, so I can actually show you this, it's easier just to show you. So I remove that from Facetto Word, and I manage NuGet packages, browse for dna.framework, and it should show up. Okay, this is taking forever. What's going on? Have I broke my internet? There we go, that took forever. So we click that, install, and okay, accept. And then if we go to the app, I think is where it's in the startup. This will now fail because that doesn't exist, but the point of that is now if we did framework, which is the DNA framework, dot say start up the original call, you can see we've got no comments. So all of our XML comments that are on our classes, so obviously all of these comments here, this comment, everything everywhere, the whole point of these is we should get IntelliSense showing the comments and they're not there. So the reason they're missing is because when you go to your project properties of the thing you're making the NuGet package for, go to build and make sure to check XML documentation file to generate the XML. So even though this generates in a different folder, so if we were to go to bin, debug, and here, you can see there's the comment file. If we were to just delete this, or in fact, delete the whole bin and the object, change this to release, uncheck, or rather check that, make sure it's in the release mode. So debug mode, we actually don't want them in. Go to release mode and build the project as normal. You'll see we have bin, release, and you've got the comment file. So we right click and do pack, we should get the NuGet package and see it's 11 kilobytes. And this is how you know it's got comments in. If you uncheck the XML, right click and pack, you should see this will drop in file size to now 8 kilobytes. So you know it's now included more data. So the thing I missed in the creating a NuGet package video is to make sure you check XML documentation file in specifically the release build, because that's what you'll publish in. So that's that done, and I might as well quickly show you how to now publish your next version. So this is now ready. We want the next version. So one thing I would do is go to, where are we? Is it baked into, no, it's baked into the package, I believe now anyway. So in here, it's all in this package section. So you can focus on this area. We'll change it to 1.0.1. We'll change... In a way, I want the author as me. I know it shows up as me, though, when I search, but... Oh, well, leave it as that. I was going to change that to Angel 6, but it can stay as me. So we have that, and we'll also bump up the assembly version. The assembly file version is the physical... the physical files version, that can be different. I tend to just keep everything matched. So just change all three so they're matching, and then you don't get any confusion. So once you've got all three, that's it. Build, just to be sure. Right click, pack, and go to your file. And we should get 11. We haven't got 11. So that hasn't been built, I don't believe. That's why you want to make sure. Probably best deleting and building. And I've noticed this a few times. See how it's not building now? It's as if it thinks it's built because maybe we just need to do a clean solution and then right click and pack, and it'll build and then clean. So I'd always wipe your folder and then make sure, wipe your bin and object folder, do a build clean, and then publish. So now this is ready to push. And all we have to do is do the CMD, and then in here we do the .NET NuGet push key S, and we'll do all that. So I'll do that offline. You've seen it done in the last video. I'll push this live. That will be done. That is all done. So we're okay there. And this will then work once this is pushed and it's live in NuGet. I can just right click for Setter Word, manage NuGet packages, go to updates, and DNA.framework should show here, and then I'll update. And then I'll push all this source code live at the end of the video, so all this is already done for you, but now you should be able to follow. So hopefully that was a good explanation of extension methods, as well as, like I say, an actual use. And again, like at the end of each video for a while now, I'll just mention I do now have a Patreon page. If you guys want to support me in what I do, fund the videos that are free. So if you go to patreon.com/angel6, then you'll see my Patreon page here, where you can support what I'm doing. I've got goals and pledges and all sorts. You can have a good read on there, find out, and if you decide you want to support what I'm doing, it's entirely up to you, but that would be really beneficial. And as always, any comments or questions on the video, any help you need, just mention them, and I'll get back to you.